If we eat carbs and fat together, does that make it more difficult for us to lose weight, or does it even make us get fat? Is it okay to eat carbs and fat together? Now, a lot of people think it's absolutely crazy that combining carbs and fat can potentially halt weight loss or even make us get fat. But in this video, we're going to be going over a pretty simplified reason as to why combining carbohydrates and fat could be detrimental to weight loss, and then I'll explain why there could be some truth and validity behind all of this. And then lastly, I'll tell you exactly how I would approach this and then give you 3 really helpful tips if you are looking to lose weight effectively. Now first, when we eat energy in the form of carbohydrates, we break them down into glucose, and this increase in glucose is going to actually lead to the secretion of a hormone called insulin. And insulin is essentially just an energy storage hormone where one of its jobs is to just shuttle glucose into our muscle cells where it's stored as glycogen, and then once those glycogen stores have actually reached their capacity, insulin will start to shuttle the glucose into our fat cells. So ultimately what happens is when insulin levels are high, we are in an energy storage state. And this is not ideal for people who are trying to lose weight. And another thing that happens is that when we eat carbohydrates and we see these high levels of insulin, our body actually starts to prioritize the usage of glucose as energy versus using fat as energy. Now, to be clear here, if we are eating carbohydrates, we cannot use fat as an energy source. So to quickly recap here, high levels of insulin induced by carbohydrate consumption are going to prevent us from using fat as fuel while also causing us to enter an energy storage or fat storage state. And this is where it gets a little interesting because we haven't even talked about fat yet. Now, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. So if we are eating carbohydrates, we're seeing high levels of insulin, we're already in a fat storage state. So what happens if we start to eat another type of energy called fat? Well, where is that fat going to go if we're already in this energy storage state? Well, I'm sure you guessed right, because that fat we just consumed on top of the carbohydrates is also going to get stored in our fat cells. So basically what's happening here is that when we eat carbohydrates and fat, the carbohydrates are going to cause our insulin levels to elevate, which is going to prevent us from using fat as a fuel source, and then at the same time is going to put us in a fat storage state. And then when we eat that fat as well, because we're already in an energy storage state, that fat is going to continue to be stored as energy and cause our fat cells to grow even further. So that's just the basic idea behind all of this. But can this actually be true? Okay, so in nature, there are very few whole, natural, real foods that have both high amounts of carbohydrates and high amounts of fat. Now, typically in nature, what we find is that most types of foods either have high amounts of protein and fat, or they have high amounts of carbohydrates and fiber, but rarely carbohydrates and fat. The only time that we actually see high amounts of fat and carbs together is with milk, nuts, and avocados. But with nuts and avocados, those actually contain quite a bit of fiber, which is actually going to reduce the amount of net carbohydrates. And when you think about milk from a fundamental perspective, it's designed to help babies grow rapidly. It has the perfect composition of macronutrients to help boost growth. And another thing is that when we actually look at foods that do contain both high amounts of carbs and fats, well, these types of foods are typically going to be processed and ultra processed, hyper palatable, super delicious foods that when we eat them, we just want to keep eating and eating and eating. So to take a look at a couple of these, we have donuts, chips, cookies, ice cream, pizza, french fries. The list really goes on. Now, I think it's safe to say that all of these contain both a lot of energy in the form of carbohydrates and fat, and they are all very, very easy to overconsume. And a third thing that we can consider from an oversimplified perspective is that if we're carrying extra fat on our bodies and we essentially have extra usable energy that is stored all over ourselves. So is it even 100% necessary to continue to eat so much energy in the form of both carbohydrates and fat, especially if we're trying to lose weight? I mean, intuitively, it might make more sense to eat less of those energy type foods and try to eat a little bit more of another type of macronutrient, which we are going to talk about in a little bit. And lastly, and probably the most compelling reason why combining carbohydrates and fat can potentially disrupt weight loss is this. So we release hormones called incretins that, when stimulated, can further increase insulin secretion, which we know puts us in an energy storage state. Now, research shows that when we eat carbohydrates exclusively, these carbohydrates are going to stimulate our incretins, which is then going to stimulate insulin. And this is already on top of our carbs breaking down into glucose, which is then also going to stimulate insulin. So we're essentially seeing this double whammy effect here. And what happens when we eat carbs and fat together? Well, we're going to see an even greater incretin response, which will then further increase our insulin, which will then increase our energy storage even more. So I think there is some compelling information here, but would I recommend not combining carbohydrates and fat together? I have 3 things to say about this. Number 1, when it comes to weight loss, I believe we should try to keep our insulin levels as low as we can, because that's going to allow us to transition into a fat burning state. And one of the best ways to do this is to keep our carbohydrate consumption relatively low. And if you're going to be keeping your carbohydrates low to keep your insulin levels low, then the likelihood of you really ever combining carbohydrates and fat together is going to be low as well. So by adhering to a low carbohydrate diet, you're not really going to be running into this problem very often. Number 2, I'm a big believer in the PE diet, which recommends that we should try to eat equal parts protein and energy, so carbohydrates and fat. And we really want to prioritize protein with this type of strategy because protein is arguably the most important macronutrient. It provides so many building blocks for our body. It's really filling and satiating. And we as humans have pretty high protein satiety drives, which means we essentially just eat food until we've met those protein requirements and needs. So the PE diet works really well for weight loss. And if you're interested and want to learn a little bit more about it, you can check out my video right here. And lastly, I'm also a huge believer in eating real single ingredient whole foods. And like I was saying earlier, there are very few natural foods that contain both high amounts of carbohydrates and high amounts of fat. And if you follow this approach of eating whole food, then the likelihood of you eating carbs and fat together is going to be pretty low, because remember, most types of food are going to be coming in protein and fat, carbs or fiber, and not a whole lot else. But if I am going to be combining carbohydrates and fat, I'm mostly just going to be eating some sort of protein and fat and then coupling that with some sort of fruit or veggie. And as a side note, fruit is always going to be paired with fiber, which is very beneficial and can also help with that insulinogenic effect. So the big takeaway with all of this is that you can really reduce the likelihood of eating carbohydrates and fat together by 1, just reducing your carbohydrate consumption, 2, eating real, whole, natural food, and then 3, trying the PE diet. And by doing all of these 3 things, well, they can really help you effectively lose weight and keep it off for good. But what do you think? Do you think that we should be eating carbs and fat together? Should we be avoiding them? I want to hear what your thoughts are, so please leave a comment down below and let me know. Okay, well, if you enjoyed that video, then hit that like button and subscribe to the channel if you're interested in learning more about losing weight while getting healthy. And again, if you want to check out one of the absolute best strategies to enhance weight loss, you can check out my video on the PE diet right here. All right, thanks for watching the video, and I'll see you soon.